Hey guys, before the video starts, I kind of want to explain what this podcast is and why we're doing it. Basically, what this is just a conversation between me and another person, whether it be a student, a parent, a teacher, or another person in the community that's affecting our lives, and sitting them down, talking with them about what they like, what they're interested in, what they know about, and keeping the community together, especially in this time when we don't get to see a lot of other people and hear new things or new perspectives on the world or on the community that we live in today. So I hope you enjoy. Hey guys, and welcome to the first ever podcast. Today, our first guest is Peter. Peter has worked with me along with Ben and Aiden in this Thinker club. And so we thought it'd be a good way to kick off the podcast with someone in the club. And so Peter, if you didn't know, is the president, and that's one of the many things that he does. And yeah, so thank you for being here.
Thank you, Isaiah. It's exciting stuff for a podcast.
Oh yeah, kind of think about things to do for the club, and this is kind of what we decided to do as one of them. But today is all about learning more about Peter, I guess. So yeah, I know you're big into philosophy. That's kind of what I've learned as I've gotten to know you more. And I was wondering if you could kind of just talk about how you got into that more, because I know we've discussed things for philosophy, but we haven't really gotten into your background in it. So I'm interested to hear about that.
I think it really came from a desire to understand concepts beyond what like your perception is, because you see things and you experience things, and technically your experience is your own reality. It's like technically the only thing that's like ontologically real, but you develop into higher levels of abstraction, and things become more apparent to you. The only real reason why I studied it, or I found meaning within it, was to establish a sense of a coherent worldview. I think is when people don't understand the history behind things, when people don't understand the history of thought, and this ongoing 2,500-year-old conversation, they get confused, and it's just a lot of people in our generation today, like they become all nihilistic and they lose hope in everything, and they don't know what the purpose of life, or like these questions aren't actually dead questions. So people say philosophy is dead. It's like these are questions that are very prevalent in your mind and very prevalent to your existence, and for a similar reason as that, that's really how I got engaged into it.
Yeah, I know for me, when I started just to question, you kind of go down the route of nihilism, which for people, if you don't know, it's more like saying that, like, since I can't prove anything, nothing really matters. At least that's what I've gone. I'm sure there might be a better definition. But yeah, I've had some great conversations in the Thinkers Club, and then also just with the cabinet members about certain more like deeper topics. But how, like, do you think that philosophy should be a part of everyone's lives, or to a certain extent? Like,
I mean, here's the thing I always explain to everyone, is that no matter what you do, you cannot escape philosophy. Insofar as you exist, like the very notion of existence is very philosophical. The very notion of thought, it's called epistemology. How do you know what you know? What is the nature of how you think? So you can't escape it. What you can do is, number one, be obscenely ignorant to it. And number two, you could develop your trajectory. You could develop an understanding. I think that's really the only two options you have. I mean, there's not engaging in philosophical thought, if that even is possible, or being ignorant to the concepts of it, is one way to go on your life. And I think many people probably go on their lives and truly follow that path. And I think it reminds me of something like Nietzsche said. Nietzsche said, if you want to have faith, then believe. If you want truth, then search. Something along the lines of that. It sounds really interesting. But I think that's kind of how it is. You really can't escape it, but what you can do is develop it. You can understand it.
Hmm.
You see that it's embedded within your existence. It exists insofar as you exist. That's a big misconception people have about it, especially in this day and age. Um, I think people are getting more interested in it nowadays, within the notion of it, because people are asking questions. Of course, that's very natural. I know you were asking a lot of questions, like even a couple days ago, and we've had a lot of conversations about this, even amongst cabinet. Um, and so I think that's kind of the appeal of it, is that no matter what you do, you are bound within its domain. No matter what you do, you will be within the conceptualization of philosophical thought. Uh,
Yeah, and I know for me, starting to explore, it's definitely provided, I think, a deeper understanding or deeper appreciation for just life in general. But if you were to say, like, are there specific things that you feel like people get out of, like, participating in philosophical thought, or is it more just a general uh, well-being for your life? Like, what would you say is like specific benefits of living a philosophical life?
well, I think no matter what you do, it depends on what you mean by philosophical life. But if I'm going to interpret it, as I said, you are, no matter what you do, you're leading somewhat of a philosophical, whatever philosophical life entails. I think what you're trying to say is a life full of questions, right? And so leading that kind of life, what does it do in terms of well-being? I think we have to define what philosophy actually is. Essentially, if I'm going to talk like etymologically, it just means the pursuit of knowledge. Um, but I think it is beyond that, because you have to know what a philosopher is, and you have to trace the history of it. Um, and that really comes down to, this is a kind of a more like a really advanced but rudimentary concept of, when I talked about transcendentals to you last time. It basically just means the transcendental is the predicate notion that allows another conceptualization to exist. Um, for example, if I say that sleep is a transcendental to learning, right? What am I saying? I'm saying that for learning to exist, the predicate notion of sleep has to exist. So you get a hierarchy, right? Let's just say, let's talk about um, the notion of anger. Okay, this is an arbitrary concept. I'm not saying it's necessarily true. The notion of anger. Well, why are you mad at someone? Oh, because they wronged you. Now, why does that wrong you? Because they took something from you. Now, why did they take something from? Why does that anger you? Because it's against the law. Why does the law exist? Because of community and general will within the community, and you trace it all the way up to concepts of morality. And that's the progression when I talk about it. So it's really been about finding higher domains of transcendentals, finding the singularity point, um, the progenitor of all thought. And I think that's
Is
really been it.
Would you say that's a specific philosophy, or is that general to like all philosophies? It's like,
No,
is
that's
that
been the historical purpose of philosophy. Like, for example, I'm going to trace it back to you. Um, there was and he was born 1596, died 1650, I think. Um, his name was Rene Descartes. He's the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am." And that guy said the transcendental of it, um, was a priori knowledge, what you can find out from intrinsic knowledge that you're born with, a priori, right? And then he was what you call the rationalist. He said all the sensory emotions, all the sensory images, all the sensory senses were all false, and the only thing that was real was the abstraction of knowledge you were born with. And that was his highest transcendental. From virtue of that transcendental, from virtue of that notion, all things came into being in human thought. But then there's another guy. His name, he's one of the English philosophers. His name was David Hume. He said, no, 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 no. The highest transcendental, by which is a predicate virtue in which all things exist, um, is a posteriori knowledge, knowledge you develop out of experience. And I think you were kind of going off that notion unintentionally yesterday. And he's saying that using the scientific method as the highest point of transcendentals, that you can explain all things and all abstractions using the scientific method. And then there was another guy, and then this feud, this development, you see it develops, the conversation develops, and there were two opposing schools of thought. And the profound moment was a guy named Immanuel Kant. Now, ethics, we're not going to talk about Kant's ethics because those are nonsensical. Now, I've complained about it a lot. But what he did, he had something called the synthetic a priori knowledge. And that's something that you have innately, but also have to test it experimentally. For example, Kant said that synthetic a priori knowledge was mathematics. You have it innately, right? 7 plus 5, you have that notion of um, abstract knowledge of mathematics innately, but you have to test it for you to actually figure it out. So it's this interesting loop of innate knowledge and experiential relevance. Um, and so that's if those are the real big points of it. And then the other points, it gets complicated with the subject-object dichotomy. Um, but if you trace the history of philosophical thought, that's what it has been. So when you talk about a philosopher, you have to make sure you're defining it in terms of transcendentals, or else you get weird definitions. And I think I had a conversation with someone about it, I think like almost 2 weeks ago. I'm not going to bring it up, but it was relevant to a specific person's definition of philosophical thought. Of course, that depends on your vernacular and how you define it contextually. But that is a historical purpose, whether they called it that or not. That has been the reduction of what it was in the term of history.
Well, yeah, I feel like what philosophy does is, a large part of it is like figuring out how to define specific subject matter, because then you can go from there, and depending on the definitions, like really digging into what it actually is. I've noticed that. And then when speaking to the two kind of schools of thought with Descartes and Hume, I've like what I like in the little thinking that I've done around the two things, it's easy to jump to Descartes and saying like the only truth I know is I know that I exist. I think therefore I am. Um, but I feel like that's so much of a dead end from what I've explored. And so if you go through to Hume's, and if you go through that, it leads to much more verbose exploration, because it allows for you to rely on your world. And that's from what I've known. I haven't extensively studied either method, but in the little think I've done, I feel like it's so much more rewarding to go along Hume's, like what he started with. Um,
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that like the reason why people don't understand why we studied the Greeks, or why we studied um, Descartes, or why we study Hume, or the history of Western philosophy. And the reason why we do it is to number one, get a notion of what the conversation develops into. It's a progressive dialectical notion. You can't just, and this is kind of goes off what Hegel says. He was the last German idealist, but Hegel made a good point in saying that you can't just flip to a random page of a book and say that you understand it by reading that page. I think that's a common mistake that people make. It's one of those things, if you want to discover this notion of truth, or this concept of it, you have to go through the entire process to realize it. Like it's like what I said before. If you want to understand a story of a book, you have to read all the predicate notions before. You have to read the pages before it. You can't just hop into like chapter 13 and say, oh, now I understand the book, now I got the overarching picture. If you want a coherent worldview, you have to do it also within the progression of chronological in a chronological perspective. You have to be able to understand it, the causalities.
Understand the situation that's put in as well, like whether it's through the different causalities, and also just like you need the contextual information to fully understand the thing. And I think this also brings to an interesting point of philosophy, because I know you're someone that tends to use certain diction that's more, I don't like just at a higher level or complex. And I feel like for a lot of people that can be discouraging, or can be a turnoff for discussing philosophy, because they feel like it's this foreign, unknown, too high level thinking, or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's perfectly fine, but I think also it's important for people to understand that you can participate in philosophical thought without using, or like being completely versed in every single philosopher or these terms. It's like it starts with just questioning things in general. Um,
Mhm.
I think,
Well, I think the reason behind my diction is because at one point, this is later on, when you'll go, at one point, the way you articulate a specific idea is extremely important. Um, and it's also because of the fact that, like, I really want to appreciate the English vocabulary. The reason why I don't speak as colloquial anymore is because of that, the matter of articulation. Um, but also because of the fact that you can probably trace every, like, 95% of conversation that someone will have in their entire life makes up less than 2% of the English language. And of course that's because a lot of words are obsolete and stuff. But there's a definitive reason behind my diction. But I think it really comes down to two options that you have. Either and this might go into an idea of a hermeneutic, but that's different. But you have two options, and one of the options is to try to comprehend what it means. Um, and when you work through those notions, when you do it yourself, then you actually comprehend it. I can't explain it to you and have you comprehend it. But if you can comprehend the things I'm trying to convey, then you'll get to it. The other notion is to just think it's gibberish, which is a totally valid option too. I mean, I told you, you can't escape it, but you can choose to understand it, or you can choose to be ignorant to it. And it's one of those things, like, the more you learn about it, the more you realize, the less you know. Um, I think that's a beautiful notion too, but it really does, like, it can be a daunting thing. Um, yeah, that is true,
yeah,
but
I think people
like,
can work towards using language like that because I understand the purpose it has and the ability to explain things to a more clear or specific extent. But I think also what I'm trying to get at is that people don't need to start like that. Like the journey through philosophy is you don't start at like after like you've worked through, and so people
yeah,
shouldn't be intimidated by the idea of philosophy just because of where you are because you're someone that has studied philosophy a bunch and now you can use more precise diction, but it doesn't, it's not a requirement per se to start at least.
no, it's definitely, like, this is how I look at it. You can't escape. One of the difficult thing about philosophical notions is sometimes its inability to reduce. And I can go on that conception later on, but like a phenomenology, it's one of those things you have to experience, but you can't articulate it. And I think everyone is a phenomenologist in their own way. You articulate your experience, but not every experience is necessarily available in a linguistic subset. Because every time you use a term, you and I have to agree to use that term for it to be coherent, right? If I use a term, let's just say, like, let's say over the abstract, like truth, right? You and I have to agree on the definition for that conversation to move on. But the same thing is with a lot of notions, is that words are really, really abstract in the sense like this. You have an emotion, you have an idea in your head that you want to articulate, but the confusing thing about me receiving it is that not only do I have to discover what a word means, I have to understand what that word means relevant to the context of the sentence, right? And the linguistic subsets of that. And then I have to do it relevant to the train of thought you were going off of within the entire context. And then after that, I try to deduce what you're saying. That's to know that's like the progression of thought. When you speak to someone, it just happens at a really fast rate. And so that is the thing behind it. Like, you definitely cannot jump um, to a certain philosophical tradition. There's no way you can skip through it. You have to go through the whole thing, because the thing is that if you don't, a lot of things someone or I will say will not make any sense to you whatsoever. Even if you reduce it as much as possible, it won't seem coherent. Right? You need a different perspective. Um, and I think that's the whole point, is like you have to transcend your current perspective. You have to look at it from a different point of view for things to make sense. It's like, you know that game, like, that people play on their phone where, like, it's like an image but you twist it and then it fits
Hmm.
together. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like that. So a lot of things, the reason why a lot of things I would say will sound confusing is because it's a challenge for you to rotate that image to see how it fits together. Because the the perspective someone may be looking at something when I'm talking is like that different angle of an image, but the more and more you try to work through it, the more your mind will wrap around it. The more you'll fix a perspective, so you see why it's all coherent, and it's always an image that you never thought it was going to be. Um, Going back to Hegel, I barely know. I mean, going back to this guy named Hegel, he said that the notion of the methodology has truth at its end goal. And truth is never what you think it is. But that is the end position. The whole point is the journey of getting there, is the methodology of getting there. You can't just jump to the end and understand it. I could give you the answer, but what the answer will seem like to you is that distorted, is that picture at a wrong angle. I can't force your perspective. I
Hmm.
can only give you the general notion of it, but then the rest of the task is for you to get there yourself independently. Um,
So the like relationship between language and philosophical thought, or just understanding of the world itself, deem that almost necessary for someone's understanding because you need that like contextualization.
yeah, in a sense. Well, I mean, the notion of language is really, really underrated in the sense that like a guy named Wittgenstein said that the limits of language are the limits of the world. Um, as in, you can't really conceive um conceive a thought really, not an experience. An experience is a different thing. You can't really conceive a thought that you cannot necessarily articulate. It's the importance of being a linguist. You have to be able to articulate a lot of these thoughts for it to try to make coherent sense. And
Well,
especially as you develop yourself into higher levels of abstraction, that is the importance of it.
I see that, yeah, like how language ties us to reality. But it's interesting because you hear of like Elon Musk talking about the ability in the future to possibly able to transmit thoughts on their own from person to person with 0% loss of like what
Yeah.
the point is. And so I'd be interested to see like how does that affect, is that like will they get, even if they can send what that mind was thinking to another person, will they be able to understand?
What that mind is. Is that the whole like it's like the whole Neuralink thing, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the where it'd go off of, and obviously that's in the
You
future.
tr- are you I would have a couple questions about that. Like I wonder if you're like sending an entire experience over, like
Yeah,
an entire mode of thought. Because what if you have like trauma and you're having a trigger for traumatic effect? Are you like sending all your trauma over? Because that could be damaging.
I know. I
Um,
think. Well, I'm just.
a lot of things you say are filtered through you, right? Um, like everything you interpret, even in your memory, is all filtered through you. So
It'd
I
be, yeah.
wonder.
I don't know how it
I
works. It
do
kind of
wonder how it would work.
transcends language to a certain extent, and the only way that humans can communicate now is through language. Which,
Well, no, I bet there are a lot of ways to communicate. Because not everything, as I said, not every experience is representable by language, right? For example, like there's a reason why the arts are still so valued by humanity, why it's such a high standard. Like music for a lot of people, it is a powerful force, and most people agree um, in some notion that the abstraction of music is um, a language in and of itself of expression, why it moves you, why it triggers a specific response from you. I mean, it brings something back. You filter it as something. So there are a lot of ways of expression, not all of which can be put in just into words, like a painting, like abstract painting. If you really understand the notion behind that, the beauty of abstract painting, um, it's really you maximize the the experience of it, but you minimize the skill. It's like it's a scale thing. But that I'm tangenting there. But yes, there are I think multiple ways of expression, just not that aren't just words.
mhm. Well, I think kind of, I feel like we could talk about different philosophies for a while, but if you had like one suggestion to get people started in a pursuit of philosophy, what would you suggest? Whether it's like a person that they should study or a way of thinking that they should start with. This, how do people become actively involved? And like even if it's, I know you're saying you can't exist without philosophy, but how do you become more actively involved? How would you suggest is the best way?
Do you mean like develop your trajectory?
Sure.
Well, you need the point of why people engage in it is to establish a coherent worldview. It's reducing the normative. right? What you see as normal, what you experience of what you're taught as normal, fundamental causality. It's a reduction. An x equals y does x equate to y. Um, and for that, you really have to be open to the notion of that image perception thing I just talked to you. That things that seem incoherent to you before, um, at a different perspective, will seem coherent. And I think that's the story behind Einstein and his equation for um, general relativity. Especially, no, it was general relativity. It was an old equation he was flipping through his notebook. Um, that didn't. It was the one that he said, "No, this is absurd. I'm not going to do that. That doesn't make sense." And he looked at it from a different perspective. He said, "That's it, right there. The notion of general relativity." Um, but it's the same thing, and I think two most important things um, is general intelligence um, and openness. You can't be ideological. You can't be stubborn about it. You can't hold on to what you would believe because then you will never. It's evident when people are really ideological. They'll say absurd things and try to justify it. Um, and at that point, it's not even worth talking to them per se. Um, but so you have to be open to that notion. You have to be able to absorb all the knowledge. And I think and you have to think, imagine the world in more complexities than you realize. Um,
Yeah.
why it's important that people if you want to study philosophy, like why example like I wanted that comes into knowledge with my study of like history or psychology or law, um sorry, or why I look at stories and other text,
Yeah. I
why I
think
learn all of that in like economics as simultaneously is just you have to see it in those complexities of existence because then you get a coherent worldview.
having that understanding of the situation that things exist in. And then also, I think when it comes to just people starting, it's like really question why you believe certain things. And maybe it's right to believe, but for me, that's kind of where I started personally was like, why do I believe what I believe? And should I believe what I believe? And that can lead to a very complex train of thought that I still haven't answered, but it's definitely interesting and exercises your brain. And it's an important concept, kind of more abstract view. And so that's, I think, philosophy is something that is generally foreign to people to a certain extent, but also is what I've come to learn. And you seem to understand that it's an important part or can be an important part of life. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, and then I think shifting now more, kind of interesting more about like what else you do in your life. I know you work for a nonprofit, have nonprofit, so I'm interested to hear about that. If you
Oh
have
yeah,
anything.
yeah. I've been serving as well. I should probably go back into how I got into it.
Hmm.
Um, like it relates to the same reason why I got into philosophy. I grew up actually learning more about theology. Theology comes from the Greek word theos, which means God. It means God. It essentially means God studies theology. Um, and so that's what happened. I moved to San Francisco when I was in, I want to say second or first grade, second grade, first grade. No, I moved to San Francisco when I was in first grade. Um, and in second grade, we started a nonprofit with just like my family, just giving out food to homeless people on the street. We got like in and out and something, and I think like it kind of just grew from there. We had a house church. It was started out again with just my family, and then it grew. Um, and then during the winter, sometimes we'd pass out jackets, and it really started out really, really simply. Like it was just a family. Um, my parents didn't speak English too well, but it was just like it was something that started out of heart. Um, and by the time in fifth grade, we had like 20 people in our church or something. Um, and so that's how it started with there. But I started serving after I got into theological text. I started studying going back to like speaking Korean. I served as a translator, like simultaneous translator, which just you stand up with a mic and then you translate what the minister is saying. Um, and then just starting recently, I started ministering for the church, which has been a really interesting experience. It's been really fun, but it grew. It's like 70 people now. Um, And even with our jacket sharing thing that was just like a brainchild of a thing we had is um, like 600 jackets or something, just like last year, which is crazy. Because you used to start out with 5 people, now it's like almost like at least 70 people participating, and like over 500 people waiting in line now. So if you told me that when I was younger, I would have never understood it. Even with our things on Saturday, it's like we pass out like 300 burgers or something like every week for the
Yeah.
past like couple of years now, or we've increased the number, and it is quite a feat of faith. And I think it's one of those things like um it's one of those things, especially with faith. It's like they don't call it a leap of faith for nothing. Um, you do jump, and um you hope for it, and there's nothing else you can do. And I think that kind of leap of faith is what really starts all of it. You never perceive how big it'll become, but it's about what you can do now. I think is what the overarching essence of it is.
Yes, I think, and it's an interesting thing because especially people our age, finding purpose in life is a very difficult question. Some people choose to ignore that question entirely, and other people seem to find it. But finding what like what gives you a purpose or meaning in life is hard. And I know one way is through faith or through giving. But like, is you think is that like finding a way through purpose? Because a lot of people are tied up in school, and do you think it's important to be involved in other things to kind of find a purpose?
Well, you don't have to be involved in anything to find a purpose. Um, but it will definitely be there's I think a lot of people read the book. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And Frankl there quotes Nietzsche. I'm doing a double quote here. It says, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." And it does go on that notion that especially when you haven't studied the 19th or 20th century, and why you feel like you don't have a meaning is because um people are lost in that sense. You need people without a purpose easily lose hope in all things. um how important is meaning? I think everyone in essence lives life to search for some kind of meaning. The pursuit of meaning seems to be what it's really about. But I think people think that you'll get happiness through meaning. um so it is generally important that you have a sense of meaning, because then you're working tirelessly. You don't have to be involved in anything, you don't have to do anything extra splendid, but you have to have something that does get you moving, that really does get you up every day. That notion, that inner sense of trajectory is important. Like they say you don't have to have a plan now, and I kind of object to that in a certain sense. Like, I'm not saying you have to have a life plan for you right now, but you have to have a goal of where you're going, because then you can have the best ship in the world and the greatest crew in the world, but if you don't know where you're going, you're still lost. I think that's what Schwarzenegger said in like some random emotional speech thing I saw one time on YouTube. But I thought that was
But it's
especially
powerful,
interesting.
yeah.
It is powerful.
I think, yeah, finding direction in your life, that's through purpose. And that direction might not be the ultimate direction, but trying to go somewhere with your life and
Yeah. At least
moving.
you're going in a direction. At least you're going in a trajectory. That trajectory can change, whatever, that's fine. But you have to be moving towards something. Um, I hate quoting Nietzsche for the third time, but I think the reason, I mean, Nietzsche is really popular among younger people these days. Actually, there's some reasons why. It's because he said a man would rather believe in nothing than not believe in anything, something like that. I mean, people want to believe in something, or any direction at all, than to believe in totally nothing at all. When you
But
become
yeah,
a Yeah, and I think
having that, like using, like it could be through like having philosophy. It's a lot of questioning. It can lead to what I found is it can lead you to lead like can lead you in a way where you can stop believing in things, which I think is
yeah,
destructive. And I think it's important to question things, but completely stop believing in it. So it's interesting because you seem to pair this theological and like you are religious and pairing that with philosophy, do you think that is a helpful way to give meaning in it while questioning at the same time?
Depends on what you mean. Um, the reason being I say this is because a lot of people I see like stop at this point of existentialism. Um, that you have no meaning, and like you can believe it. It's honestly a worldview that you look at from a specific angle. Um, the need for a genuine objective ideal, it is especially important. Like I say this before. Nietzsche was an atheist. He was a big. This has nothing to do with theism, atheism. It has nothing to do with that per se. But what he did realize um, was the danger of nihilism. Because when you're people who are nihilists end up going into the arms of totalitarians. It's not an uncommon thing. Dostoevsky, the writer of Crime and Punishment, the guy who really delved into the extent of human psychology, predicted the Bolshevik Revolution. Nietzsche predicted the events of World War I, World War II. He said, because God has died in the 19th century, the 20th century will be the bloodiest this world has ever seen. And there's a reason why he said that, because Nietzsche understood the psychological importance of the genuine transcendental of God, that of which of God's virtue all things come to being. And you take 2,500 years of history and civilization and institution, and what people think that it's a good idea is to destroy the whole thing and try to start again. What do you think will happen? You have 7.4 billion people on Earth. You took 2,000 years, no, more than two, like probably 7,000 years of human institutionalized history, and you want to abolish the whole thing. And that's the problem with it. Is like Nietzsche insofar understood the importance of at least some ideal of the psychological importance of the transcendental, which is why he says in his book Genealogy of Morals, essay 2, section 24, section 24, the anti-nihilist, the antichrist, that man must come. Of course, he had his criticism against Christianity, but overall he did understand the psychological importance. And I want to show you how this plays out, because it's especially important why urge people to study the 20th century, is because people, institutions, what you get, and Nietzsche predicted it very well. Look what happened in the 20th century. Nietzsche said that because God has died, there is no left, there is no right, there is no up, there is no down. How do we wash this blood from our hands? He knew that people would get lost in nihilism. What the 20th century showed was World War I, right? World War II, the Third Reich, the USSR, Mao Zedong. Why am I scared of subjective morality and the subjective experience of nihilism? Look at the Boxer Rebellion, 20 million apiece. More people died in warfare in the 20th century than the previous 19 combined. And it's always the people who know the signs who see it first. They see it first, they understand it first. As artists first, the artists are the first one there, and then it's the poets, and then it's the philosophers, and then it's the scientists and the thinkers. And so there is this genuine importance to understand that. And especially because we have this movement as postmodernism and neo-Marxism. And the danger behind this ideological side, especially with whatever you determine as radical, whatever you determine it as, is when you get ideologically radical, you lose track of what it is. The reason why nihilists fall into the arms of totalitarians is because they'd rather not live with the burden of existence and the burden of responsibility, the burden of freedom. Freedom isn't free, the burden of freedom. And they would give up all that with their identity and fall into the arms of totalitarianism. And if you read Eric Hoffer's True Believer, you understand that with utmost clarity what it means to proselytize a mass movement. And this is when I say you have to make the reduction, you have to make the connection of the psychological trend, the historical trend, the philosophical trend, and the existential trend, and seeing how the acts of humanity to be. And that's especially important in this day and age, because you see the same repetition of humanity cycling over and over again. which is why I'm always warning, and why a lot of things I say may sound offensive or may sound terse or may sound very abstract, because it's not necessarily that it's necessarily that people don't understand, that people aren't realizing the cyclical progression that humanity has followed and aren't willing to break it. I mean, it's going to happen again. I mean, um, Albert Camus said in his book called The Plague, he said, war and pestilences have always occurred in history, and yet when they happen, we are always surprised. Or something like that. I'm barely butchering his thing, but that's the essence of what he said. And so that's the importance that I put in getting a coherent worldview and why I want to understand things.
Yes. Well, I think this is a lot for people to digest, and hopefully people are inspired to start thinking and getting a better understanding of the context of certain things and a deeper understanding of the world. And that starts with questioning. And it can get you, from what I've seen, it can get you very far. Um, and I think you've shown that you just have to start somewhere. It can lead to a very meaningful life. Um, but yeah, thank you for being a part of this. I think this is very engaging, exciting
Of course.
conversation. Um, Looking forward to doing some more of these in the future, but you're a great person to start with, especially for this Thinkers Club. And
Yeah.
yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. We'll be back soon.